Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to everyone, and welcome to our latest SpinFire Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Fiona Caton and I'm responsible for SpinFire business development and marketing within Actify. And I'm joined today by Mark Anderson, who will be demonstrating SpinFire to us shortly. You've all arrived in listen-only mode, so please use the chat box on the right-hand side to ask any questions during the webinar. And I'll also be prompting you at times to just make a comment if you want us to get back to you about a particular subject. Mark is going to share with you some tips and tricks shortly, and we'll cover topics such as some of the latest features in SpinFire, improvements to the user interface, and making the most of the user. Before I hand over to Mark, I just want to cover a couple of subjects myself to check that you are all aware what the latest released version is, our recent importer updates and our licensing options. So SpinFire Ultimate 11.7.2 was released on the 3rd of March last week. A couple of questions that you might have about this. Is this upgrade included in your license? Excuse me. All customers with a valid maintenance contract are entitled to download this. If you're not sure when your maintenance expires, then you can check on your homepage in SpinFire. If you think your maintenance date is incorrect in SpinFire, you might need an updated license file. If this is the case, you can just add a comment to the control panel now, just put maintenance, and then we'll double check this for you and get back to you. Or if you think your maintenance has expired and you're interested in getting this updated so that you can have the latest version, then just add a comment expired and we'll come back to you as well. And how do you upgrade? We recommend using the direct download link. And I believe Mark is just going to copy that into the chat for you. This link always points to the latest release of SpinFire. So providing you're under a valid maintenance contract, you can download and then run as administrator. But again, if you've got a comment or you're using a floating license and you're not sure, you can add upgrade into the chat box and we'll come back to you. Or at any time, you can always email our support team at spinfiresupport@actify.com. So I just wanted to check that you were all aware of the different licensing options that we have. Many of you will be using a fixed license, which is locked to your PC only. We have floating licenses, which is a great way to share SpinFire between users that don't need a license all of the time. SpinFire can be installed on as many PCs that you want. And just an example, if you had 2 floating licenses, this would allow 2 people access to the license at any one time, 2 concurrent users. We also offer an enterprise solution, which we refer to as ECV. It's based on your company size. It can cover your whole organisation or just a subsidiary or individual site. If you're a smaller company with 5 licenses or more, or a larger company with 10 or more licenses, then it really is worth asking us for a quote to upgrade to an ECV. this gives you an unlimited number of SpinFire licenses to use across the organisation or that particular subsidiary or individual site. You just tell us how many fixed or floating licenses you need. And it may be possible, depending on who the contract covers, that you could have a site license which is based on your domain. So for us, it would be actify.com. And this gives you one seat ID that can be activated an unlimited number of times. So if you're interested, please add an ECV comment in the chat box, and again, we'll come back to you, or you can email sales@actify.com at any time. And I'm just going to whiz through this. These are the importer updates that we've had with 11.7.2 and the previous version in December, if you missed those. And a final comment, obviously Microsoft has ended support for Windows 7, and we will do the same now. The current versions of SpinFire will continue to work okay, but if you're submitting any issues with using SpinFire 7, Windows 7, that we can't replicate in Windows 8 or 10, then we won't fix them. And an early notification that SpinFire 11.9, which probably isn't due until the end of the year, won't be released in a 32-bit version. So I'm now going to hand you over to Mark, who will show you his demonstration.
Thank you, Fiona. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So starting off with this demo, I thought I'd first jump into licensing. Since 11.7.0 onwards, we've had a number of improvements around licensing. And even a new feature. So one of these was the timeout feature. So we have more information on the help site, but essentially there's this file that you need to create by hand that you put on your floating license manager, and the minimum timeout that you can put is 15 minutes. And of course, if a user's not using SpinFire for 15 minutes, the license gets returned back to the server. They do get warned with a pop-up window that they will lose the license if they're not using it. But of course, with 11.7 onwards releases, in order to use these versions and the timeout feature, you need to ensure that your floating license manager is using 11.16 that you can see here. That was in the that's under the help and the about. You can find the version. So if you have that version, your 11.7 onwards versions will work, and you'll be able to use the timeout function. I thought I'd just quickly mention that what we have on the page here, the Activate Online, that is for people with a fixed license. So it's just a license available on your specific machine for an individual. And activating floating license, of course, is if you have a floating license. So of course, it's advised you do not use the Activate Online, because you could then run into issues trying to use SpinFire. One of the reasons for this would be if your particular floating license manager is configured to use a specific port, when you do the use that activation as an example, it would not have the port number coming from the server, so you of course not be able to activate. So you just have to ensure that the server name, the MAC address, and the port number, if one is specified in the file, license file, are correct, and then you should then be able to activate correctly. So let's jump across to the settings under applications. You probably notice how my copy of SpinFire has a dark theme. Of course, you can change that from the modern light, or for those of you from the sort of that's been with us since SpinFire professional days, you can go back to classic mode with those sort of color schemes and icons, if that's what you're more accustomed to. I think, yeah, Fiona mentioned this in one of her slides. We have the check for updates, as well as the download link being available on our help.actify.com website. This can be set to never check for updates, or only when done manually, or to check every so often, day, week, or month, every time you open SpinFire. So to do that manually, you would go to help and then use the check for updates. So I'm on 11.7.2, so I'm on the latest version. So let's jump across to 3D Viewer. And here's some of the new features that we have, such as the ignore Act3D and 3D background color and gradient values. So if somebody else is using background colors in your in these versions of files that just do not suit your purpose, if you have this setting enabled, you can ignore the colors being used. Another use case scenario would be for those of you that are Centro customers. If you're outputting Act3D files with a specific background color, your SpinFire, any of your SpinFire users, if they chose to, can ignore the background color that was saved to the Act3D file and just use the background color that their SpinFire is using. So we also have defined materials, so aluminium or aluminum, copper, etc. So that all the materials are listed in here with a certain value. You can of course change these values along the bottom. You can create your own name, your own value, and you could then export this list to keep a backup copy or to share it with a colleague perhaps. We also have the shortcut toolbar. So instead of using those drop downs that we have along the top in SpinFire, you could create your own little toolbar with which measurements you want to be using on a regular basis, and then you can choose whether or not to show these when you load your SpinFire file. It's fine if you didn't, because there is a shortcut key, Control T, that makes it that will make it display if this setting's not enabled, and you can just keep clicking that back and forth to turn it on and off. There was something I did want to mention on the application page, sorry. We also have the optimized memory setting. So for those of you working more with really large assemblies, during the time that the file is being opened, so not when it's loaded, but during the time it's loaded, or just around the time it's just finished, it can be holding up a fair bit of memory, depending on the type of file and what resources your hardware has. So with this setting, what it does is release that memory. It reduces the amount of memory that's needed, and it also releases it much quicker if you have this setting turned on. So if you're on a particular machine with not a great amount of memory, of RAM, let's say maybe like 8 GB, and you're working with big files, this is something I would suggest just giving that a try, just to see if you notice a difference. We also, but going back to 3D Viewer, we also have the load surfaces on demand. So again, this comes back to large files with a lot of assembly parts that may be made up of a lot of surfaces. and perhaps there's oftentimes you don't really necessarily need to load the whole assembly with all the surfaces. So what you can do is just load the surfaces that you're actually working with. So when you expand the assembly tree, at that instance, at that point, the surfaces will load. Sorry. But if you're having any other technical issues, one of the things to consider is also to check your graphics driver and to consider trying the OpenGL 2 or DirectX 11. But I would say 90% of the time, the auto setting will choose the correct one to maximize your performance. So I would like to just also mention we have a translation editor as well, and we have about 10 languages. And what's really nice is that you can actually just go in and for whichever language you may not be using, you can just go in there and change the translation to a different language that we don't provide with the product. So for example, Swedish or Greek, etc. So any language that would be your preference to work with or with your colleagues. And again, like you saw with the materials and the shortcut toolbar, these can be exported as well or imported into another copy of SpinFire. If you need to move machine and you've gone through all these changes to your materials, your shortcut, etc., etc., what you can do if you're moving machine and you don't want to lose all that work you've put into setting all this up, we have the export settings and the import settings. So by default, it will export the settings that are different from the default settings, but it's also possible to just export everything regardless if it's your default values or not. That's also an option. Then of course you just import those settings into your other machine, your newer machine, and you're good to go. You should have all the settings imported. So let's jump across to importers. As you saw from Fiona, we have an update for NX to 81872. I think in 1172 in particular, it was updated for the 2D side of things. Solid Edge and SolidWorks were updated to 2020. So let's now, yes, yep. So we have merged, so we have this all options, which is all the options that are in all the importers. And some of these overlap with each other. So the most common ones are, of course, like hidden objects, wireframes. And when I put my mouse pointer over these ticks, you can see there, it tells me exactly what importer this would apply to. Sorry. So if you don't want to spend time, obviously, going through all these individual importers to change a setting, you can apply it across all the importers and not have to think about it again. So whether that's like checking for missing parts, perhaps the tessellation level, perhaps the document type you're opening. So that can be applied across all the importers, and of course you can reset the to default for all your importers. So there's tessellation, and of course we can see which importers that affects. Yes. Before I go to the workspace, there is another thing I've wanted to quickly cover under the tree management again, the display tree attribute name. So any attributes, any data in the files that we can see in the CAD properties of your assembly tree, we can now in fact choose the name of that of what's in the file, and that can now be displayed alongside your assembly tree. So in this case, generated name is now displaying against each of the parts. If I right click on one of these parts, go to properties, I can see some of those CAD attributes here. So that was so that's coming from generated name. Yeah. So so that could be, so it depends on what's on the file, of course, but just in my example, I could have used who last saved it, when it was last saved, you know, that particular part. At the moment, this is limited to one column at a time. Of course, if this is something you'd like to see further development on, please drop us an email at spinfiresupport@actify.com and we'll look into that. Jumping now to, I'll just quickly cover the library section of SpinFire. If you go to, so these are folders on my machine I've added to my SpinFire library. And if I go to, let's go to my C-Scooter. There's a shows details button. So if you just want to see just the file name, the file size, perhaps the last modified. Otherwise, if you click the show tiles, you get the tiles. You can make that larger. Of course, you can search by directory folder name down the bottom left here. It's very crucial to be aware of this, though, that a connection you can remove without losing the files, but if you try to delete the folder when it looks like this, the yellow folder, you're actually deleting the files. So you get, are you sure you want to delete the folder? So of course I don't want to delete that, but I may want to remove the connection. So it says, are you sure you want to remove the connection? So I won't today, but that's how I would do it. Sorry. And of course you can search by the file name, you can do a file search at the top right of the screen. So ski scooter, there you go. Something we also brought back with this release was the 3D preview. So if I click on my Act 3D, I have the preview window here. This is in Windows, this is not SpinFire, but you do need SpinFire installed for this to work. But we have the choice now to load the 3D preview. And of course, I can rotate that and zoom in, zoom out. So quickly jumping back to options, just to turn that on, there's an option here. But please be aware that you are increasing the size of the Act3D file when you turn this on. That, of course, includes anything like brep, etc. So be mindful of that, especially if you want to be sharing it with other users. So let's go over to the workspace again. What we have in this in the 11.7 releases is the GUI changes. So if I do my Control-T, you can see here I brought the toolbar, and I can place this anywhere on my SpinFire. So it doesn't have to be floating like this. I can dock it in somewhere. So in this case, I would like to put it over here, and I now have direct access to all these measurements that I like to use in particular. So I don't now need to go into a menu every time to find what I'm looking for. I can just get direct access to what I'm using 90% of the time. And like I said, you can put this anywhere you like. That's my favorite place up here, but you could of course put it over here, down there on the left hand side. And this applies to everything else as well. So this toolbar, the workspace toolbar, that can be placed down here. And of course, you can do the same with the assembly window as well, the Explorer, and put that over here as well. And another new setting we have in this release is the show the front-facing PMI. So if I go to this model, sorry, without that setting, these lines are, partially hidden for me unless I kind of rotate it and stuff. But with this new setting, of course, that PMI stuff can be put in the front of the model now. So that's very, very handy to have that now. So let's go back to this file. Let's now, actually, I'll just quickly jump back to this model because I just wanted to mention, if you make changes in your settings and you're not sure which settings you have on while you're in the model, something that you might find useful is the view output. And you can actually start seeing, and here you can see whether or not a wireframe or the filter is on, whether or not the attributes have been pulled in or not. So that information can be found in here if you don't want to make the change in the settings and then open the model again just to find out. So this is a way to find out whether I have to sort of go back and forth with it. So that's just an FYI. So let's do, yes. So user views. You may have seen these in the past, us demonstrating this in the past. User views is any work that however state the model is in, whether it's markups or section cuts, etc., whatever state it's in, I can save these to a user view without doing anything drastic to the sort of the integrity of the model. So, sorry. So one of my section cuts, I saved it to a user view. I did a couple of measurements. I use these 3 measurements here. These options show up when you do a section cut. So let's jump across. So another example of the user views is with the 2D nodes, you can link to other user views. So like that. So we're in this user view called links, but I could have a link here that goes back to the section cut. And if I go back to links, I've got one that goes to the Actify website, and one that even opens a file. So how do we do that? So when you create a 2D node and you place it here, if you go right click and you go properties, you can either enter the hyperlink, the URL address in there, like I've done in this is to the file, sorry. Otherwise, if you use the drop down menu, you can go to the user view, or you can browse to the file, and yes, sorry, you can put the URL link in here as well, and you can have a description and comments, etc. So let's create a user view from scratch. So let's do the exploded assembly. Let's rotate this model. Let's explode this model. Okay. So I'm happy with that explosion. That's exactly what I want to see. I click the user view button. So let's call it that. And let's cancel that. One thing just to mention though, a close means you're accepting the explosion. So if you're doing that in a user view or the default CAD view, it's cancel you want to use to undo this exploded assembly, but only use close if you want to keep it as it is, depending on what user view you're in, or yeah. So in this case, I'm happy with this. So I'm going to close this because this is how I want the parts. So now let's do auto note. Now auto note, I could do it for all the parts, but that would be very excessive given how many parts there are. So what I'll do in this example is select the parts manually. So let's start. Oh yeah, I need to select here first. Then I select the part. Okay. So you see it turns yellow because I've selected it. Okay. Now once I'm happy with that, yeah, that looks fine. So I do stop selection, and then I do use the generate button. And there you have it. Without having to do the notes by hand on every single part, I can use the auto note to do this all in one go. I just have to select the parts. Or if it's a small assembly, I just do it for all the parts. So yeah, there you have it. So just to make sure this will be exactly how I want it, we're just going to just double check, just to be sure. We're going to update the camera, update geometry, and if I go back to my default CAD view with no changes, you see it's not exploded anymore, of course. So, but if I go back to that view, that's how I left it. And that's the same with any color changes I make. So let's do a pink. Okay. And then if I go back to the default view, you see it's only pink now in that user view. It was pink. So now when your files are open in SpinFire, any CAD views that were in that file are imported as well, of course. But we also have our own standard views, and these are like from a kind of 2D perspective. So that's why we have this kind of grid and a ruler there. It changes as we zoom in and out. So again, we could do let's do a measurement. And let's say that's what I want. I'm happy with that. And then if we go to user views, create a new user view. So 2D view plus note. Okay, and I go back to default view and I go back to that user view. You see, it keeps the change. Any of my changes that are in a user view, they're kept. Let's go back to doing a section cut. So one of the things, let's see. So if we do a single plane section cut, sorry, if we do a projection mode, like you may have noticed I had earlier, you get a shadow. I can create a 2D document of the section cut. So I actually noticed there's a couple of settings missing on this section plane I have at the moment. So let's go to define and let's show. All right. Okay. So let's create a 2D document, and that's based on the section cut. So let's do. Oh yes. So of course, because I've done this section cut and I've exported it to a 2D document, we can now use the 2D Smart Edge to do some measurements. Of course, I can do some callouts. I can do some stamps. Of course. And let's see. Oh yes, sure. There are a couple of shortcuts I want to just mention. So the shift and left click allows you to move the part like this, because otherwise by default the left click is just a rotation. There's also control left click for zoom in, zoom out. If there's changes I've made, I can also use Control Z to undo the changes. You know, that will include even the camera. Otherwise, the other way to do the undo and redo of any little changes, I can use this menu up here, and you can see I can go all the way back before I did any camera moves or markups, etc. And I see I'm running out of time now, so I believe that was everything I wanted to show today. Thank you very much for attending. If you have any follow-up questions, please leave them in the chat or drop us an email at spinfiresupport@actify.com. Thank you very much for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Mark. I just have my final screen just to say thank you very much for everyone that attended today. and or listening again when we send out the recording to everyone. We've captured all of your questions and comments, so we'll be in contact with you over the next few days. But please feel free to contact us. Any sales, commercial related questions, send an email to either your Actify contact or sales@actify.com, and we'll pass it to the right people. Or any technical issues, you can always email SpinFire support@actify.com. And any future webinar topics that you might have, then please feel free to email them to marketing@actify.com. Many thanks again. Bye.